Welcome to the Woman's Current. Is the Tide Turning? I'm Sylvia Beckerman.
And I'm Molly Wadzik. Together we're exploring how women support women across generations, experiences, and perspectives.
From baby boomers to millennials and beyond, we're asking, are we lifting each other up? And how do we keep the tide moving forward?
Each week we'll dive into real conversations with women who are reshaping the currents and reflect on what those stories mean for all of us.
So let's dive in. Let's get started.
Even people who enjoy a lot of privilege and access can feel like their power is taken away from them by the medical system and sometimes by the legal system in ways that surprise us.
Today on the Woman's Current, we're joined by journalist and author Irin Carmon, whose newest book, Unbearable, 5 Women and the Perils of Pregnancy in America, exposes the lived realities of pregnancy in a country where policy, politics, medicine, and power collide. Through the stories of 5 very different women, Irin reveals the systems that protect them and how often they don't. What I love about how she reports with clarity and compassion, there's no sensationalized women's drama. She listens to it, contextualizes it, and connects it to the forces shaping all of our lives. This book is a mirror held up to America and an urgent call for accountability. I'm here with my co-host, Molly, and together we're diving into what these stories tell us about power, care, autonomy, and what real support across generations can look like. Let's get into it.
Thank
Irin,
you so much for having me.
welcome.
Thank you.
I am so glad that Molly introduced me to you and your newest book. And so we have a lot to talk about. Your book follows 5 women whose lives look nothing alike. Their differences show how unpredictable and dangerous pregnancy can be in America. What led you to these particular stories? And did you feel that they needed something larger?
So I always like to say that I want to thank Samuel Alito for the inspiration of the book because I have been covering reproductive rights as a reporter for about 15 years by this point. And it had been about 12 years when the Supreme Court opinion in Dobbs overturning Roe v. Wade came down, first through a leak and then through a final decision a few months later. During that time, I was super pregnant. I think I was 6 months pregnant during the leak and 8 months pregnant when the Supreme Court officially let half the country ban abortion. And I felt a rage literally in my bones at the fact that so many people were going to have rights stripped from them in a way that was so ignorant, willfully ignorant of the realities of becoming pregnant. So when I scanned that decision, I saw a week-by-week accounting of fetal development, which was all about how at this week this happens and at that week the unborn child, quote unquote, has taken on the human form in all relevant respects.
Can I stop you for 1 second? Because I read your introduction. Well, I read the book, but the introduction, you have something specific moment.
Mm-hmm.
Can you tell us about that?
For sure. So it's funny because I have, so at this point that I'm reading this week by week fetal development, I'm very happily pregnant and yet I am deeply aware of what an enormous undertaking, a personal sacrifice, a huge transformation any pregnancy is. And so imagining this pregnancy being foisted on people, being forced on people, and giving birth being forced on people, it filled me with a deep sense of solidarity. But I didn't expect the abortion war to literally end up in my exam room during my pregnancy until the moment that you were referring to, which was when it was just a few days after the opinion became final. And so half the country was thrust into chaos. And we went for a 32 or 33 week ultrasound, my husband and me, for what is now my daughter. And we had this crazy image up on the screen like I've never seen before, like a full face with an expression. And I said, wow, I said this, by the way, kind of tongue in cheek. She's really starting to look like a person now. And, the ultrasound tech had been perfectly nice. But at that point, she sort of said she seemed deeply offended. And she seemed like she needed to defend my fetus against me. And she kind of looked at the screen and said, you were a person from day one. And I was like, oh my God, lady, read the room. What I didn't include in the book is that as we were leaving the hospital, and this is a Manhattan hospital, we went in there for an ultrasound. I was seeing a midwife, but I had to go to the hospital for all of my tests. And some guy, but my first pregnancy had been during COVID, and I had barely left the house from when I started showing because my first daughter was born in June 2020. But as we were walking down the street, some guy said something like, "You look really hot when you're pregnant," and then turned to my husband and said, "Sorry," or something like, "No offense." And I was like literally, could you be made to feel more like your body is public property? Now, none of these people had the power of the state or even the medical system in the ways that I describe in the book. But I thought one of the things that I really wanted to do in the book is to draw the connections between different experiences of reproduction that have been separated. And the reason that I chose these 5 women's stories to highlight was because in different ways, each of them, as you mentioned, they were very different from each other. But what made their stories similar and the through line was the ways in which when they became pregnant, America stopped treating them like a full human being and stopped according them the respect of their personhood. And even though that shows up very differently in each of their lives, their choices, their decisions, I thought together it painted the full picture or a fuller picture of pregnancy in America, regardless if you want to be pregnant, if you want to end your pregnancy, that America in both its medicine, its culture, and also its law has limited and narrowed the horizons of people who become pregnant.
How pregnancy is politicized, right? I think that's the biggest thing about your book that has been a really good intro for me to promote it to other people. Is this isn't just about, this is a systemic failure of American healthcare.
Yes.
Yeah. So sorry. Go ahead.
And over the weekend, I was at a funeral of a family friend, and it was a mother of a good friend of mine in Kentucky. And I found myself at a table with another friend of the family who was a Christian homeschooling mother of 4. And she was asking me about my work. And I thought, and there's some people in the book who are actually pretty much fit the description of her. But, she was asking me about my work, and I told her a little bit about it. And there are a bunch of people at the table who know that I'm very stridently, robustly pro-choice. And they were all looking at me like, "What are you doing here?" And I was like, "No, but we can connect on this. We can connect on this because she had a bunch of home births and she feels really passionately about maternal health." And then it turned out that she follows one of the people that I write about on Instagram who is not very well known at all, a maternal health advocate, Jose Perez. And she lives in Kentucky and is a Christian homeschooling mom of 4. And I just thought, what I really want, it hasn't quite happened yet with that demographic, but what I really wanted with the book was for people to read these stories and to understand, people who think that would never happen to me or I would never do that, and see how these external forces end up intimately kind of invading what should be a very personal experience in the way that you just mentioned.
And the thing is, you do take 5 different scenarios, 5 different people. You have 2 women who have catastrophic C-sections. One survives, one doesn't. A woman jailed after giving birth. A woman denied miscarriage care, and an OBGYN who's trying to build safer care in a hostile state. I mean, their differences are, they're unpredictable, and they're dangerous pregnancies that not only can, but do happen in America, one of the richest countries in the world.
Yes.
So tell me, it had to be terrifying and grounding. How did you feel as you were reporting this?
Well, there is something a little bit perverse, I guess, about spending my 2 pregnancies reporting on the worst possible things that can happen when someone is pregnant. But I think that I just felt so, and I continue to feel, but at that moment even more so, a deep passion for thinking about how personal and how important these moments in a person's life can be, and how even for me, with all of the privileges that I had, it was challenging and it was intense and it rocked my world. Pregnancy, postpartum, trying to get pregnant. And so I just felt like it could be so much better than this. I thought the unbearable does not need to be inevitable. And every day, the country makes choices to be this way. And I was trying also to understand, how did we get here? And so one of the things that I wanted to do with the book is you're, I hope, really getting to know these 5 women as they experience, infertility, miscarriage, trying to provide better care when it's really hard, just trying to have a safe birth, trying to get an abortion. All of these are different experiences that they don't happen in a vacuum. And so I wanted to also step back and tell the story, the history, and the politics of how medicine and the law came to situate us this way. And so we tend to think of these as just very personal experiences, and they should be. But at every step of the way, the women that I write about, their experiences are shaped by forces that are so much bigger than them. So you understand them as an individual, and then you see them collide with the force of what this country is and has chosen to be.
So you're talking about care and the differences and how it's a personal journey, but it happens so often. And that's what people don't understand, that it's not just a one-off. And you talk about the medical, what did you learn about how the medical, legal, the political structures intersect to make pregnancy more dangerous, than it needs to be?
So I start most of the history with the 19th century in the United States and the roots of American obstetrics and gynecology being in the practice of slavery, and how the so-called father of gynecology, J. Marion Sims, was experimenting upon enslaved women in the service of trying to restore their fertility and produce more enslaved people. And so there is this from the beginning, a deep injustice in the way that formal American medicine was practiced. It's brought us many significant and important life-saving advances, but that is a core part of formal American medicine's history. And then I also write about how when these doctors of the 19th century, who were all white men, almost to the one, wanted to take over birth and pregnancy care from midwives who had historically provided it, they did so in part by opposing abortion, by capitalizing on eugenic fears, racist and eugenic fears. So saying that the country was being flooded by immigrants. What does this sound like? Saying that women were wantonly ending their pregnancies and a fetus and an embryo is a person, and only they, the doctors, could decide the course of a pregnancy, and only they could provide a safe birth. And so it was fascinating to me to see how, from the beginning, all of these themes that we are trying to understand when we think about the experience of being pregnant in America, the punitiveness, the anti-abortion ideology, the top-down kind of patriarchal experience that many people have, the racism that many people experience in the mainstream medical system, and also that from the beginning there were people who were working within the system trying to make it better. And that's why it was so important to me to include Dr. Yashika Robinson, who was an abortion provider in Alabama for as long as it was legal, but who was also at the same time attending births, providing gynecological care to underserved women, to a place where maternal and infant mortality is some of the worst in the nation. And so, it's not a broadside against medicine, but I think it's explaining how pregnancy in particular became this kind of nexus point for a patriarchal takeover of medicine, and how even people who have developed all of the expertise and the experience and are brilliant are really fighting against the tide when they're trying to treat their patients as individuals who are capable of making their own decisions in consultation with medical experts. And so Dr. Robinson's story, she's the only one who's not really pregnant in the course of the book, except for her 2 experiences of becoming a mom in her teens. But she's somebody who exemplifies what pregnancy care could be if we brought these values of racial justice, gender justice, treating each patient like an individual and not like a statistic or just kind of a cog in a machine that's supposed to generate more babies. And so it was very powerful to me that Dr. Robinson was doing that work only a few short hours away in the same state of Alabama where J. Marion Sims conducted his experiments on Black women. And so I think that the American system contains some of the worst possibilities of pregnancy. And we use punitive measures like locking up women for using drugs during pregnancy, especially in places like Alabama. But it also includes people who are powerfully working to make something better, like Dr. Robinson.
And Molly.
I think we're so used to hearing institutions talk about empowerment, but your reporting really shows just how unsafe those institutions can make a pregnancy. I'm wondering, was there something you uncovered that shocked you even after so many years of reporting on gender and policy?
Yeah. So it was really important to me. I knew from the beginning that I wanted to report on Alabama because Alabama contains that story of the history of obstetrics and gynecology. And it also, for a very long time, had a continuous tradition of African-American midwives who were providing care when nobody else was offering it, and continued for as long as they could. And because Dr. Robinson was there, and because Alabama is the most punitive state when it comes to locking up women who are pregnant. But in some ways, for those of us who live in blue jurisdictions, like, we expect to hear bad pregnancy stories in Alabama. And I knew, in part from my own reporting during 2020, during my first pregnancy and during COVID, that New York City, where I live, had its own mess to clean up and its own ways that this inequality visits itself on people who get pregnant here. And so it shocked me during that time to realize that in the United States, I knew that the racial gap in maternal mortality is already unforgivably high. So most years it's something like 3 or 4 times. A Black woman is 3 or 4 times likelier to die for a pregnancy-related cause than a white woman. And in New York City, that gap is far higher. So during the time that I was writing about, a Black woman was 9 to 12 times likelier to die for a pregnancy-related reason than a white woman. And now the overall rate is higher in Alabama. Here in New York City, we have all of the laws on paper that you would want. We have all of the resources. Like Alabama, we have the wealthiest city in the country, one of the wealthiest cities in the world. And what's our excuse? And so when I was trying to figure out how to tell this story, I was really interested in this hospital not too far from me called Woodhull in Brooklyn, because it seemed to me that it was, my first interest in it was actually as an alternative to some of the things that I'm talking about. Because during COVID, I became aware of the fact that there were these incredibly committed midwives who were operating in this public hospital place that was primarily seeing Medicaid patients. I was seeing newly arrived women who were giving birth, who were just navigating the system for the first time, and that they were getting amazing outcomes, that the health outcomes were everything that people, that the World Health Organization wants to see. And then 2 weeks after I had my first daughter in 2020, a young woman named Shaeja Semple went to Woodhull, was taken in for an induction because of high blood pressure, and died at the hands of an anesthesiologist who later lost his license and who had a pattern of this kind of negligent and dangerous care. And I was stunned to my core about how this place that I had heard of as an alternative to, for example, the Black maternal mortality crisis, which there's research that shows that going to see a midwife can help combat this crisis. And so how was it that this woman was coming in there and losing her life in a tragic and infuriating and completely preventable way? And so I wanted to start writing about Woodhull. And what shocked me to my core was how the stories of harm just kind of kept showing up even when I wasn't looking for them. And so I went to a picnic for my daughter's preschool with my then 1-year-old and my 3-year-old. And I started chatting with the moms about what I was working on. And I could feel that when I talked about it, even in the vaguest terms, that something was resonating. And I later learned that one of the women I was speaking to, who became one of the 5 women in my book, nearly died at Woodhull because of a botched C-section. And that she was only saved because when her husband screamed for help, people listened. And just barely. She suffered grievous harm. She needed a full-body blood transfusion. She's had lasting damage from what she experienced. And it was a completely preventable accident, an internal hemorrhage caused by an incision that hadn't been properly closed. 2 months after I heard that story, it happened again at Woodhull. And that's one of the other women that I write about, Christine Fields. And only when I started reporting and getting to know her surviving partner, Jose, who is left as a single dad and to navigate this cruel bureaucratic world and becomes a maternal health advocate. It's only a few months in that I made what to me was one of the most shocking discoveries of this entire process, which was that they had the same injury and the same doctor. But that when Jose called for help multiple times, he wasn't allowed in the room for her surgery. He was repeatedly restrained by security. And so even though there are some differences in terms of their timeline, the fact remains that there were two women, both young and healthy, who came to Woodhull to give birth, who suffered the same accident. And one of them is alive because her partner was listened to, and the other one is not because he was not. And which one is white and which one is black, you only need to know about America to know why it survived.
Well, Molly asked you what was the most shocking, and that is just horrific. And we know it's going on. And you call both of them an accident. That word just doesn't, as far as I'm concerned, doesn't describe what took place.
Well, when the CDC says that 80% of maternal deaths are preventable, that we see it in this story, because not only was there this botched C-section, this harm that was done to her during her surgery, but her death was preventable if nurses had done the basic protocol of checking up on a patient after they have major surgery while her husband was with the baby in the NICU. And it's enraging. And it is also possible. I mean, Jose and I have had conversations about this. I write about this in the book. He feels that they were also being retaliated against for advocating for themselves. And so it is this horrific catch-22 where, people are told, like, get a doula, ask questions, advocate. She had a birth plan. This was her third baby. There was no reason why this needed to happen. But she also did everything you're supposed to do. There was and yet the system was stacked against her. I mean, there was some reporting from ProPublica recently that really made me think about Christine's story too. Tierra Walker, a woman who was experiencing severe preeclampsia in her pregnancy and who had a series of health complications in Texas, and she begged doctors to end her pregnancy. And they simply did not listen to her. And she did what they told her to do. She was on bed rest. She followed doctor's orders. She asked questions. She advocated for herself. She was a Black woman in Texas who was pregnant. Texas has set up its laws and its society in such a way that it doesn't matter if you, quote, do everything right. And I don't want to be too fatalistic about it because there are people who are doing amazing work in it, but we also have to face the reality of what we're dealing with here.
Sure. And you can only do the work within the constraints of the system that we're in. There's only so much you can do. I grew up in Texas and I got out at 19, but a lot of my good friends live there, and it was very scary when they were pregnant after Roe. As someone thinking about motherhood and identity, the emotional cost of pregnancy in America feel heavier than ever. What are some other ways that you, other than sharing these stories, which erase this line between their story and our story, right? I think that's one of the most powerful things about the storytelling that you're doing. How do we talk about these emotional costs of pregnancy aside from the physical, right? Because even if you survive after these horrific things that the women have experienced in our systems, you talk about being punished for speaking out, for advocating, right? How do we talk about that honestly?
There's so much burden put on an individual here. These stories are treated as isolated stories, but they're not. And I mean, one of the reasons that I talked about my own experiences as much as I did, even though I don't think that they're not that, significant in the scheme of things, is because I think even people who enjoy a lot of privilege and access can feel like their power is taken away from them by the medical system and sometimes by the legal system in ways that surprise us. And so I wanted to use that as an opportunity for solidarity so that people could feel what it might be like to experience that on a deeper level and a more everyday level. I think no one is served by a culture of silence around this. And no one is served by the fact that people have fear, that they're complaining too much, or that they brought this on themselves in some way by their own actions, or that they should have done more research. I do think we've come a long way in talking honestly about it. But I also think that a lot of the people who have experienced this in pregnancy and thereafter, and by this I just mean treatment that is dehumanizing or that doesn't take into account all of the different complexities of their medical and emotional experience, they then are taking care of a newborn, or they're recovering from a loss, or, they then have to just move on with their lives. And that's hard. And they're tired. And if they're parents, they're some of the most tired people out there. right?
And that's the thing. We're told to just move on. We're
Yeah.
told to
And just be
suck
happy
it
you have
up.
the baby. Yeah. And you're both safe I mean, if we're talking about a birth experience here, it's like, yeah, great, just enjoy your baby. But I think people are voting with their feet on this. You do see so much more reluctance to become pregnant, to have children. I mean, I was really stunned when my book first came out a few weeks ago. I posted some of the videos of myself talking about it in the media, and a bunch of people started commenting about how because of Dobbs and because of what they've heard and understood from people's lived experiences of their rights being restricted, they don't want to have another child. And these are people who wanted to give their child a sibling, and they know exactly what's involved in pregnancy. It's not hypothetical to them. And so you have this split screen of people reckoning honestly with whether they're ready, even if they want to engage in a pregnancy and to raise a child in this country, and the split screen of yelling that women need to have more children. I mean, they're living on different planets.
No, it's what was it? The Amy Coney Barrett's domestic supply of infants
Supply.
line. Like that is the priority.
Right. Or asking, I mean, and this was in the Dobbs oral argument. She was asking, what's the big deal? Why can't you just drop a baby off at a safe haven? So she was setting up a hypothetical where somebody would be late in pregnancy, and why couldn't they just, wait a few more weeks and give birth? Well, there's so much wrong with it because it's implying that people are just making these haphazard decisions late in pregnancy, which they're entitled to, but it's just not really how it works in the world. And then also just kind of for somebody who has as many children as her, skipping over what is involved in birth, both as a medical risk and as an emotional experience. And then having a baby. I do feel like we have to kind of keep retelling these stories and relearning the impact that these sets of policies have on people's actual experiences. I do think we need to have a counter narrative that even if it is a really difficult story to tell, it's one that is honest. It's one that reflects people's actual lives and not a couple of billionaires who are trying to impose on us this idea that white women need to be tricked into becoming or coerced into becoming baby makers and everybody else just shut up.
And listening to this, I gave birth in the 80s. So it was easier because you didn't have this, as scared as you might be about, oh, this is new, you're giving birth. And my son was 2 months early. And back in 84, but they had just opened up a brand new NICU. He was there for 5.5 weeks, but you knew the care was good. Had not a clue what I was doing, but it wasn't as scary as it might be of this whole new experience. Add on everything else that we're going through now with the politics and the care and the lack of care and the lack of support, and telling women what they were told back in the 50s, and that was get married, have a family, move to the suburbs, yada, yada, yada.
Don't work.
I mean, how scary is it now to say, okay, I want to have, a child? And if there's anything at all, if you have a doctor that you really don't know, if you're all of a sudden now living in a state that you felt free before, you have everything else on you. How, I'm going to ask a silly question because we've sort of talked about it, but, I'm a boomer. I've gone through, I'm not getting pregnant again. How do you even talk to your friends or, people who follow you to allay some of these fears?
I don't think that it is irrational to be afraid, but I also think that people should think about what they really want and balance that with these legitimate concerns that they have. Because for people who passionately want to start or expand their family through pregnancy, sometimes I feel like it would be letting the terrorists win to let these people decide whether we are going to do that. Something that we is challenging and difficult, but for me at least, has also been one of the greatest sources of joy in my life. And I want that for anybody else who wants that. I think also and there are parts of it that are always going to be inherently challenging, right? Biology, premature birth, pregnancy complications. Many of the things we've been talking about are choices, but there's a lot of things that are not choices that are just kind of like a roll of the dice medically, or there's always going to be the unpredictability of the human body and another human body that's brought into it. But the things that we choose, we can fight about them and we can raise awareness about them, but there's always going to be this kind of deep commitment to unpredictability if you choose to become pregnant and you have the privilege to do that, to choose. And if you decide to parent, I also feel like these powerful, wealthy people giving more transportation funds to married couples that have more than a certain number of children, they don't get to own the joy of pregnancy and parenting. And their vision is, when they call it pronatalist, I don't think that they're pro anything. They're anti women and people who can become pregnant having autonomy and choice over their lives. The fact that the mask has slipped, and now every time I log on to what used to be Twitter just to see what the worst people in the world are saying, that they're openly debating whether women should be allowed to vote, whether women should be in the workforce, whether women destroyed the workforce. I mean, that's like the mild version of some of the stuff that I see. At least it's like incoherent English. These are people who are being elevated by algorithm by by the richest man in the world who remains very close to the presidency. I just feel like we need to let people for whom that doesn't speak, which is the vast majority of people, know that they're not alone. Like, we are being gaslit on a massive scale here that these ideas are popular. I do think it's also really interesting to read the history of the 19th century when it comes to reproduction and race and immigration and realize how we've been here before and we got out of it. We got out of it because people rejected that vision. They rejected the vision that said that only some kinds of childbearing are okay or should be encouraged. And then we rejected the vision that only some people count or matter. And we rejected the vision that when you become pregnant or if you become pregnant is your only value in the world. It can be a profound value, but not when it's imposed on you. And so I guess I just feel like, these people do not represent us and they do not represent most people. And so even though it feels a little bit lonely because they have so successfully taken over politics and a lot of discourse, I feel like we have to not shut up about it.
Well, that's the thing. We have to not shut up about it. We have to continue talking. We have to continue supporting one another. I've got a question for you. Compared to your earlier work, how has Unchangeable changed your understanding of storytelling as activism?
Well, my first book was about Ruth Bader Ginsburg, Notorious RBG, and it came out of a really different cultural and political moment and a different time in my life. There's exactly 10 years between Unbearable and Notorious RBG. I think it was within one day, the publication of each of the books. So it's a kind of bookend, I think, because...
How'd you pull that off? Mastermind of planning.
Yeah, right. I pulled it off by having a couple kids in between and being really distracted by reporting on Me Too. It was a little longer than I intended, but and I don't recommend writing a book proposal when you are 9 months pregnant and postpartum. I think that the big difference is, I mean, it's sad to say this, right? But Notorious RBG was written in a really optimistic time. I think Justice Ginsburg's ideas and life still have tremendous resonance for today, but she became the Notorious RBG by warning us of what could happen if the Supreme Court continued on the path. She earned the nickname when she was dissenting from gutting the Voting Rights Act in 2013. And everything that she warned has happened and more. And of course, it was accelerated by her loss, by her, not retiring and being replaced by Trump in one of history's big tragedies. Although I know people want to say it was all her fault. She certainly deserves responsibility, but we are in much deeper shit, as I like to say. Unfortunately, we are in much deeper shit than just one spot on the Supreme Court. But I bring that up because I think at the time it felt like there was a great excitement and optimism and opening up. We talked about online feminism before. We thought that if we just elevated these voices, told these stories, understood our history, that it would be enough to make a difference. And I think it did make a difference. I think it meaningfully shifted people's imagination of what was possible, and it helped people realize that they weren't alone. But it also was met by a really powerful backlash that I don't think I was ready for, and I don't think that anybody else was ready for. The reason that Unbearable is a different kind of read is because we live in a different kind of time. And I think we're in a time where we have to understand how bad it can get in order to realize how much better we can make it. But it doesn't happen by itself. It doesn't kind of just like swing back and forth a pendulum by itself. It kind of has to be dragged.
Okay, so in all of this, and believe me, I understand because I lived it in the 70s when we didn't have a lot of the rights that we have now. And one of the reasons why we're doing this podcast is to learn from the different generations, to figure out where do we need to go to keep telling stories. Did one generation not really communicate to the next one what was fought for and what we still have to fight for and what we have nowadays that is so in jeopardy of being taken away? So knowledge and storytelling and being able to communicate is so important. And what you have done in both books, especially in this one, and what you just spoke about, the differences and where we are, is one of the main reasons that we're talking, because we need not just women supporting one another, but we need the men in our lives to also push us. And I don't mean the men in our lives as, I mean, I'm raising two boys. Well, evidently they've been raised already. I raised two boys. Molly, you have boys and you have two girls. I mean, how do we communicate all of that and talk to one another? And that is so important. What are the levers of power women still have in this fight? What do you think they are?
Well, I think continuing to treat this as a central issue, by this I mean reproduction and reproductive rights and freedom and justice, treating it as a central issue and not some kind of niche concern. There was a period after 2022 where people were powerfully advocating for this, and then, it reached maybe a point of fatigue, but it hasn't gone away in terms of a concern in people's lives, whether that's conversations about the unacceptably high maternal mortality rate, whether it's about the impact of abortion restrictions, which are being felt every single day. I think these are often treated as niche issues in conversations that are not like the conversations that we're having. And so putting them at the center of politics, I think, is really important because people still don't support what's happening. Every public opinion poll that I have seen has indicated that this is a really unpopular agenda. Again, making the connections between these different experiences. When people were beginning to experience, being denied miscarriage care, bleeding out in parking lots, and everybody was asking, why is this happening? It's because people didn't understand that all of these different experiences of reproductive care are only politically separated. They're not medically separated. It's not different when you need, you might have to go to a different office, but it's the same procedure when you're having a miscarriage and when you're having an abortion in many cases, or when you're getting an IUD. I mean, these are in our reproductive lives really deeply interrelated. People don't understand that much about the human body. So I think continuing to say, no, this is not a niche issue and we have a lot of work left to do on it, and making the connections to our unacceptably high maternal mortality rate is really important. And, I think there's so much hostility in raising your voice right now about anything gendered because the algorithm has been gamed to just have people be screaming at you to get back into the kitchen or that you shouldn't vote. But even just recognizing that that is not most people, and that we should be supporting quality journalism and not just what the algorithm is feeding us, because more and more media outlets and social media is being controlled by people who have a hostile agenda to women's rights. So, subscribing to high quality journalism has never been more important. Reading actual books has never been more important. Because I feel like because I have to keep up with the news for my job, I feel like every morning I'm swimming in a toxic swamp. And I feel better every time I read actual journalism and storytelling where I consume it through listening or watching it. And so for people who don't want to live in that world, we have to keep it sustainable.
I have a question. Speaking on like moving forward.
Mm-hmm.
Feels like we're in a moment, a prolonged moment of exhaustion and awakening. What do you see that's actually, other than the powerful storytelling that you're doing and promoting people to read, which I never thought we were going to have to say, like, hey, can people just read more? What do you think actually moves the needle now? Not theoretically, but in everyday life.
So I think that local work, and I'm going to only talk about, the sphere that I wrote the book about, that I wrote Unbearable about, which is I talked about Jose, Christine's surviving partner. Since the book was published, he's actually become certified as a doula. He's through a program called Dads to Doulas, where he was already supporting other bereaved fathers who lost their partners to maternal mortality, but he is now supporting men of color as they go through the system, including at the hospital where his fiance was killed. And that is, if he could keep showing up and doing that kind of work after all the loss that he experienced, I think supporting the kind of small scale reproductive justice work is really important, because it's, as I mentioned, as people have kind of moved on, that's not as much front of mind. So abortion funds are still working in red states. They're still helping people get out. Birth justice work is really like a one person at a time thing. No matter who is in power politically, locally, or nationally, people need support during their pregnancies. And so I think doing that kind of work or supporting that kind of work, I think it can also be renewing, because then you're also kind of where life is happening. You're not just kind of clicking and scrolling. You're also like either helping support the work or doing the work yourself to actually be where people are living their physical lives out in the world and experiencing this stuff.
I want to thank you for being with us today, having this so important conversation, which at some point we do need to continue. Where can people find out more about you?
My website is irincarmon.com. They can follow me on Instagram at IRINCARMON. I don't post anymore on X/Twitter. I do sometimes post on Blue Sky as well. But please read my work at New York Magazine, which pays my bills and is where I write on a more regular basis.
Again, thank you so much for being with us. Molly, you have any closing?
Just congratulations on the book, and thank you for all the work that you do. Really, really appreciate it.
Thank you. I really appreciated our conversation.
I got emotional during that, and I knew that story because I've read most of the book, and I was listening to her on a library talk radio show where she was talking about Christine's death, and I thought, like, I already know the whole story, and it still got me emotional. Anyway.
Well, I mean,
It's
that's part of, what we're talking about here. And yeah, it is. So in hearing this, what hit you the hardest?
I think how ordinary these stories actually are, right? They're devastating, but they're not rare. Realizing, I mean, I know that from the reporting I've done. Before Roe v. Wade was overturned by Dobbs, I did reporting on SB 8 passage in Texas, which essentially was outlawed abortion for the most part, like a big abortion ban. So I know, talking to women who are navigating these obstacles in states like Texas, how powerful these stories are. But even for myself, who's done this similar reporting, it still felt like having the wind knocked out of me, hearing her talk about women in her own community, because she's right. We do tend to, I think our brains can't hold sometimes the tragedy of it all. So it's easy sitting here in New York to think this is a red state problem, even though I know it's not, logically, statistically. Just continuing to tell these stories to remind ourselves this is not their story and our story, her story, my story. This could happen to any of us. And the rates at which it is happening to women of color in this country is unforgivable and despicable. So I think that understanding that these aren't rare, they're not rare stories. They're happening every day.
They're happening every day. And Irin has told us a lot of her reporting. And it does happen every day. And it happens in places that we think we're safe. Just like we talked about poverty happening in some of the richest towns and cities when we were talking a couple of weeks ago with the PAD project.
Yeah.
All of this is happening all over, and we can't put our heads in the sand because you never know when or who you might know that this can happen to. If we are not telling the stories and speaking out, it's going to get worse.
Yeah, I kept
Before it
thinking
gets better.
if we want to know what a policy really does, you have to listen to the women surviving those policies. And I think that's the biggest thing that Irin's book has done, is given a platform to the women who navigated these actual policies, rather than just being words in a paper and having everyone dissecting that and talking about what the outcomes might be. Well, here we are. There are women who are surviving what is happening, and we have to listen to them.
We have to give ourselves permission to speak the hard truths, ask real questions, demand safety, and refuse silence. And the current changes when women refuse to disappear. Thank you so much. This has been great and moving. So that's it for today's The Woman's Current. Until next time. That's it for this episode of The Woman's Current. Is the Tide Turning?
If this conversation sparks something in you, we want to hear from you. What's this week's current moment? Tell us on Instagram at The Women's Current. Share it with a friend. And don't forget to follow and subscribe wherever you listen to podcasts and on YouTube.
Join us each week as we explore how women are supporting each other and where do we go from here.
Until next time, I'm Molly Wodzik.
And I'm Sylvia Beckerman. Thanks for listening. This has been a Life of Prey production.